Was founded in 1873 as the western terminus of the Gulf West Texas and Pacific Railroad. The township was bounded by the Cuero, Chisholm, and Irish Creeks, and Colonel Schlacker, along with his assistant, T.H. Valdeck, surveyed and supervised the construction of the GWT&P Railroad from Indianola to Cuero. On March 4, 1873, the first passenger and mail train pulled into the town of Cuero. Among its passengers were Mr. and Mrs. C.C. Howerton and family, who were the first Episcopalians to settle here, being members of the Grace Episcopal Church in Lavaca. In the autumn of that year, Louis Seligson and family came from Lavaca, and also the Otto Buchels. On New Year's Day, 1874, the R.M. Forbes family moved into town from Lavaca. This made 7 members of the Episcopal Church living within the town. These people were the beginning of the Grace Episcopal Church of Cuero. In March of 1874, the Right Reverend Alexander Gregg, Bishop of Texas, arrived in Cuero to hold services and to preach what was probably the first sermon ever heard in the town of 600 people. McCullough Hall, now extinct, was the scene of this service and was located across the tracks from the old railroad depot. As a result of this service and a meeting which was held in the Walter K. Breeden home, the idea was born to build a church in the town. Mr. Howerton and Mrs. Forbes met with Mr. R.J. Evans, president of Gulf West Texas and Pacific Railroad, and discussed the possibility of moving the old Episcopal Church from Lavaca to Cuero. Apparently, Mr. Evans thought very kindly of the idea. Not only did he agree to transport the church and all the furnishings, but to do it free of charge. However, there was a cost involved in tearing down and rebuilding the church. To this end, Mrs. Forbes, with the assistance of several other ladies, gave a benefit at which they raised the sum of $60. Colonel Schlacker made a most generous gift of a plot of land for the new building, and now all that remained was to raise more money. The community was canvassed and came up with numerous gifts and donations from individuals and business firms. In July 1874, a contract was signed with the company of McIntosh and Clark of Lavaca to tear down and move the church from that town to Cuero, with bell and furnishings, and to enlarge the church, to add a chancel, put in a new front of dressed plank and a Gothic door for the sum of $375. The move was accomplished in July, which was quite a remarkable feat in itself. Not only was transportation slow at that time, but July is a pretty hot month to do any heavy labor in this part of Texas. The heat and humidity can be quite overpowering. The heat was not the only difficulty faced by these people, but the fact that one of the wheels on the wagon broke, spilling the load and necessitating immediate repairs. The baptismal font that is still used today in our church was chipped in the fall. For a cost of $17.50, billed to the then non-existent Grace Church Cuero, the wheel was replaced and the work went on. Success crowned the efforts of these people, and by September 1874, Grace Church Lavaca had become Grace Church Cuero. The total cost, including the new wheel, was $392.50. The church and property, along with the $112.50 debt, were turned over to Mr. Howerton. The Episcopal congregation at this time numbered 35 communicants, namely Mr. and Mrs. C.C. Howerton, Mrs. R.M. Forbes and 2 daughters, Mrs. Alice Townsend and Miss Jeanette Forbes, all of Cuero, Dr. and Mrs. T.S. Burke of Concrete, Mr. later Judge Henry Clay Pleasance, Mrs. Pleasance and daughter Margaret, Ab Webb, and Mrs. Jenny McCormick, all of Clinton, Mrs. J.A. Wimbush, Mrs. F.L. Lynch, and Mrs. Montgomery Blackwell of DeWitt County. Continuing with excerpts taken from Mr. C.C. Howerton's journal. As this building was the only house of worship in the town, the Union Sunday School, which had been organized in 1873, was invited to occupy the building. The invitation was accepted. Now, up to this time, Mr. Howerton, having entire control of the church property and affairs, notified the members of the church and all who contributed to it to meet at the church for the purpose of electing a vestry. The following gentlemen were elected as vestrymen: Dr. T.S. Burke, H. Clay Pleasance, Ab Webb, F.B. Wimbush, and C.C. Howerton. The newly elected vestry in turn elected Henry Clay Pleasance as senior warden and C.C. Howerton as junior warden and treasurer, and F.B. Wimbush secretary. The unanimous voice of the vestry was to invite any Christian who believed the Apostles' Creed to worship in our church. This has been the voice of the vestry ever since. Grace Church was now an integral part of the town of Cuero, which by now numbered close to 750 people. The church building was there, on its own lot, behind what is now Means Furniture Store. And like many a church before and since, this parish started its existence in debt. This debt, remarkably enough, was entirely cleared in less than a year. Again, it was the ladies who did the lion's share of the work, turning the town gay and giddy with ice cream sociables, entertainments, dinners, and the like, until the sum of $112.50 had been raised. Spearheading these efforts was the Ladies' Aid Society, the first parish organization, which was formed in October of 1874 to uphold the hand of the vestry and priest in all parish matters. 1875 saw quite a few firsts for the little parish. The first debt was cleared in June. In the fall of that year, the first organ, costing $225, was bought, installed, and paid for by the Ladies' Aid Society. Included among the many donations was a gift of $10 from the Honorable F.S. Stockdale, Governor of the state of Texas. Also $50 was contributed by Mr. Charles Morgan of New York, President of Gulf, West Texas and Pacific Railroad. In January, when the Right Reverend R.W.B. Elliott, first missionary bishop of the new district of Western Texas, made his first Episcopal visitation to the little church, he officiated at the first confirmation ever witnessed here. In this first confirmation class, there were 3 people. This was also the first formal service in the little church, presided over by a clergyman. The first marriage in the church, Mr. Tom Smith to Mrs. Josie Brown, both Presbyterians, took place in the fall of 1874. The first marriage performed in the church by an Episcopal rector, the Reverend F.R. Starr, was to Mr. Otto Starker and Miss Margaret Forbes on March 7th, 1877. In March 1877, Bishop Elliott appointed the Reverend Francis R. Starr as first missionary priest in Cuero. Mr. Starr's tenure saw quite a bit of material improvement in the parish. In 1878, Bishop Elliott promised if the church was sealed, he would put in a round art glass chancel window. The ladies again went to work and made the sum needed, $275, and appointed a committee of gentlemen who had the church sealed. In August 1879, the bishop had the chancel window shipped. The Reverend F.R. Starr had it put in place. During this year, Mrs. Montgomery Blackwell presented to the church a lovely walnut lectern, handsomely carved and lettered, together with a large Bible and some altar cloths. During Reverend Starr's tenure in the church, the first infant baptized in the church was Miss Addie Smith, daughter of Mrs. Rebecca Smith. The Reverend F.R. Starr was succeeded at Grace Church in October of 1883 by the Reverend C.E. Cabaniss, who remained until December 1885. Under his pastorate, 24 names were added to the rolls of baptized members, and the communicant strength grew by 21 people. During his tenure in Cuero, the parish witnessed a first. Early in 1885, the convocation of the Protestant Episcopal Church for the Missionary District of Western Texas, forerunner to Diocesan Convention, assembled at Grace Church, with the Reverend R.W.B. Elliott presiding. It was the first time this little parish had been so honored. From Bishop Elliott's diary. The first Young Girls Society, named the Gleaners, composed of girls in the church who painted the outside of the church, Miss Annie Blackwell being the leader in this work. The first bell was given by Mr. Frank Bates and Mr. Frank Hutchings. The Reverend J.B. Fitzpatrick held his first service in Grace Church, having succeeded Reverend Cabaniss. During Reverend Fitzpatrick's term as rector, 7 people were baptized. The number of communicants at that time is not known due to a gap in the parish records. However, it is estimated that he left a congregation of 50 to 60. The following year, 1888, the Reverend George Henson, a former Methodist minister, was ordained deacon in the Episcopal Church by the Right Reverend James Steptoe Johnston. Mr. Henson served Grace Church for about 2 years. The town was rapidly growing, and as the city stretched its youthful legs, so also the parish grew. There were those who dreamed of something larger as their place of worship. There were those who talked of a more churchly structure. So it was in 1889, during Reverend Hinson's rectorship, that the present church building was erected on the corner of Esplanade and Live Oak Streets, where it remains to this day. It was dedicated on May 25, 1890. Following the dedication of the building in May 1890, Bishop James Steptoe Johnston recorded in his journal, "The church property in Cuero is now one of the most valuable in the jurisdiction, and the congregation is to be congratulated upon the success which has been accomplished by their zeal and liberality." The building was Gothic in style, with white clapboards and a cedar-shingled roof on the outside. The inside, adorned by 3 handsome stained-glass chancel windows, was of dark walnut. First memorial windows were given in memory of Miss Kate Seligson, Mr. Ed Menifee, and Miss Minnie Chapman. Cost of the church was $375. All of the interior wood was imported from New Orleans, Louisiana, and carefully tongued and grooved for the walls and cathedral ceiling. The church has remained substantially unchanged to the present. The church was built, the Ladies' Aid Society undertook the task of converting the first little church that had been moved from Grace Church in Lavaca to Cuero into a rectory, in which capacity it served until 1961. It was sold by the church in 1963 and now serves as a private residence. The first baby baptized in the new church was Corinne Starker, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Otto Starker, in 1890 by the Reverend Hinson. Reverend Hudson Stuck succeeded the Reverend George Hinson in the year 1892. During the Reverend Stuck's tenure, several memorial gifts were presented to the church. Among these are the brass altar cross given by the First Altar Society. This cross still graces the altar in the church today. In the same year, a new communion chalice was presented to the church, and this cup is still used at all services, a gift from the entire congregation. This silver cup was made by melting down many small baby cups, pieces of jewelry, and some silver plate, then molded into the cup. A jeweled ring, the engagement ring of Mrs. Carrie McNelly, wife of Captain McNelly of the Texas Rangers, adorns the top of the stem. The jewels that ring the bottom of the cup and stem were at one time jewelry pieces worn by members of the congregation. Also in use today are the brass missal, a pair of brass candlesticks, altar vases, and a large prayer book. The Reverend Austin F. Morgan succeeded the Reverend Stuck in 1895 and stayed until June 1897. The Reverend Alfred W.S. Garden succeeded the Reverend Morgan in 1898 and stayed until 1903. During his tenure, the first altar was given to Grace Church by Mr. and Mrs. Otto Buchel in memory of their little girl, Norma. The first brass processional cross was given and presented by the Altar Guild. The first vested choir was organized by the Reverend Garden with 19 members and sang on Easter Sunday, April 12, 1903. In the early 1900s, the acolytes took up the collection from the choir in a small beaded bag, which was then put into the collection plate, the offering not above 25 cents. The members of the choir at this time were Mrs. Frank Grizzard, Mrs. Henry Leonard, Miss Forrest Flick, Mrs. Margaret Benjamin, and organist Mrs. Frank Sames. The organ was pumped by a crippled black man named Messias Ferguson. He also greeted the parishioners while sitting on the steps as they came to church. Later rectors of Grace Church include the Reverend F.R. Godolphin from May 1903 to November 1904. Next came the Reverend John M. Hamilton from November 1904 to April 1907. Then the Reverend Upton B. Bowden. During Reverend Bowden's rectorship, since there was no Proctor Hall, the Sunday school Christmas party was held upstairs in the Knights of Pythias Hall on Esplanade. He met the group at the top of the stairs, smoking a big cigar and hugging the children. He was rector from September 1907 to 1917. After Reverend Bowden came Reverend A.J. Gaynor Bank from May 1918 to July 1920. Then Reverend G.W. Smith, October 1920 to June 1924. Reverend W.W. Reese from January 1925 to January 1926. Next came the Reverend Everett H. Jones from July 1927 to March 1930. He organized the first children's choir. The Reverend Mr. Jones served Cuero and Yoakum until March of 1930, when he accepted a call to St. Paul's Church in Waco. The parish experienced an additional pride in 1943 when the Reverend Mr. Jones, who had been ordained to the priesthood in Grace Church, was consecrated the fourth bishop of the Diocese of West Texas. The next minister to serve Grace Church was the Reverend W.A. Allen from April 1930 to 1936. Until 1936, there was no parish hall at Grace Church in which extra activities could be held. Vestry meetings were usually held in private homes. On March 21, 1936, Bishop Capers, acting as administrator to the estate of Mrs. Emma Proctor, presented to the vestry a resolution that a parish hall be erected in her memory. The resolution was adopted, and the present Proctor Hall now serves the parish and community. Next came the Reverend Allen Day in July 1937 until August 1939, followed by the Reverend J. Scott Budlong from September 1940 to March 1946. The Reverend F. Randall Williams came in January 1947. He stayed until May 1951. During his tenure, 2 lots were purchased northwest of the present church building on the advisement of Mr. Paul Breeden Sr., who was senior warden at the time. Also, an historical Diamond Jubilee pageant was held to celebrate the 75 years of the church's history. An historical pageant was presented by the children of the parish, none of whom were over 10 years of age. The pageant consisted of a tableau, which had to do with the organization and establishment of Grace Church, as well as scenes in which the first baptism, wedding, and confirmation were depicted. Next came the Reverend John W. Herman from September 1951 to November 1954. The Reverend James C. Souter in February 1955 to January 1957. Then the Reverend John H. Battles from April 1957 to July 1962. Then came the Reverend Andrew R. Crumbar from September 1962 until January 1966. During his tenure, the educational building in back of Proctor Hall was added in October of 1963. The Reverend Paul Abbott served from June 1966 to August 1972. During his tenure, and for the first time in 50 years, a new stained glass memorial window was given in memory of Paul Hamilton Breeden. The second memorial window was given by Mrs. Galliard Royce in memory of Dr. Royce. Also in 1966, under Reverend Abbott, Grace Church received a Texas historical marker. Then came the Reverend Clayton Holland from May 1973 to July 1975, followed by the Reverend John McRae Beebe from January 1976 to November 1980. During his tenure, the George Phillips family of Houston gave their home in Cuero to the church to be used as a rectory. This house was originally the William Frobasey home. Next came the Reverend Neil Fraser Innes, a very popular minister who brought in many new people and reactivated numerous others to the congregation. During his tenure, the Grace Episcopal Day School was opened and is proven to be very popular and successful. Also, the popular Lenten luncheons were started, drawing to Proctor Hall big crowds every Wednesday during Lent for soup, sandwiches, and dessert. At this time, under Reverend Innes, the men of the church also started having Shrove Tuesday pancake suppers. These are still very popular, and the men do a great job and have a lot of fun doing it. Father Scotty, as his parishioners called him, served Grace Church from June 1981 to August 1984. Reverend George Patterson Connell. Father Pat to his parishioners served from September 1984 to May 21st, 1989. During his tenure, much was accomplished at Grace Church. A copper steeple was given by contributions in 1986. The Sesquicentennial Tour of Homes and Historical Sites was held with Grace Church on the tour. Proctor Hall was renovated and a garden area added, complete with a fountain, a new sidewalk, a church sign, and a paved landscape site in front of the church, all given by contributions. Memorial plaques were donated, and some still remain to be given. Also, the library and sacristy have been refurbished. He brought in many young families with children, necessitating a nursery for Sunday services. The present congregation numbers close to 200 communicants. The vestry is still the governing body of the church and is made up of 10 to 12 members of the congregation. The Altar Guild consists of 25 women of the church who are on teams and set up the church altar every Sunday and for special services. The choir consists of 8 members and an organist. 10 men and women serve as lay readers. They are responsible for helping with the service and read the lessons. Acolytes also help with the services, and the scheduling is made up of 12 boys and girls from age 8 on up. There are 12 ushers. The Sunday school meets at 9:45 a.m. Presbyterian, Methodist, and Episcopal children meet every Sunday for combined Sunday school classes. Services are held every Sunday at 8 and 11 a.m. Also, a 10 a.m. Wednesday service is held. The women of the church are headed up by a council. This group usually meets 3 times a year or as needed. Our present rector, Conrad Bruce Wilson. Bruce arrived October 15, 1989, with his wife Sandra and their daughter Bliss, and we have great expectations for him too. Our present rectory was bought in 1989. The Reverend Francis R. Starr. The Reverend Alfred Garden. The Reverend Francis R. Godolphin. The Reverend U.B. Bowden. The Reverend A.J. Gaynor Banks. The Reverend Everett Jones. The Reverend Randall Williams. The Reverend John McRae Beebe. The Reverend Neil Fraser Innes. The Reverend G. Patterson Connell. The Right Reverend Robert Elliott. The Right Reverend Everett Jones. The Right Reverend Earl N. MacArthur. The Right Reverend John McNaughton. Some of the most faithful and oldest members of Grace Church are Mr. Walter Reifert, Mrs. T.O. Carrie Mae Bushell, Mrs. Graham Mary Sue Hamilton, and Miss Julia Pleasance. No picture is available.